Good day, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Steve Kurtz, and I've known our guest speaker for nearly a quarter century. We met in Toronto at a conference started by a joint friend, Helmut Burkhardt, at Ryerson, and we've interacted on and off ever since. We were involved in a global issues project, and we spent many hours together in the early 2000s. It was there that I first met Bill Rees, who's been a major contributor to my thinking and to Cacor's thinking. So everybody should have seen Derek's bio, which shows that he was a physicist and was involved in leading the Science for Peace project and other similar endeavors. So without further ado, I want to present Derek to you, and let's look forward to an exciting presentation, and we will have a discussion afterwards. Not as many questions are desired as comments and contributions that are enriching his presentation. Take it away, Derek.
Thank you very much, Steve, and it's good to see you on the screen again. This talk that I've planned is going to be very different from other ones that I've given during my lifetime. And while I was preparing it, I came across a copy of the Brundtland Report. And many of you will know what the Brundtland Report was. And I remember reading it some years ago and noting that the report contained a lot of recommendations. 20 years later, I tried to find out how many of those recommendations had been acted upon. And the answer, which was had a great uncertainty to it, was 2. And I thought that it was what a pity that such an excellent report, which could have made such a huge difference to the human world, had all the recommendations been adopted. I thought it was such a pity that only 2 got adopted. Now, it turns out I decided to put a chapter of recommendations at the end of my other chapters. And it seemed to me that some of the recommendations I had dreamed up are important and others were less important. So as time has gone on, I've been cutting some of those recommendations down, and I'm presenting here to you 10 of the ones that I think might be important from the point of view of Cacor and its board of directors. So without further ado, I'll start. My first and most general recommendation has to do with the United Nations Economic and Social Council. The United Nations has only 2 councils, the Security Council and the Economic and Social Council. For some reason or other, one hears much more in the news about the Security Council, but I think the Economic and Social Council is important, and I wish I knew more about it. My first recommendation then is that to Cacor is that we should really look into it, and those of us who have already expertise on what the Social Council does should look to it, because I think it has the potential to house what I might call a cabinet that could have a huge effect on facing up to the threat of climate change. So I think the Social Council has the potential to be the center of very important activity these next 25 years. And that it would be a very good idea to pursue that aim. Now, the style of this talk is that I'm not going to be answering questions at the end. I'm going to be posing questions, and I'm going to be looking for answers to such things as what I've just said. I want to know what you people, my audience, think about the UN Economic and Social Council, and so on throughout this talk. My second recommendation that I put before you is perhaps almost equally important, and it's probably absolutely vital, and that is that politicians tend to think on a time scale which is roughly equal to the interval between elections. But if you want to plan to reach a sustainable economy, or if you want to plan to address climate change, you need to be thinking on a 30-year timescale, a 30-year perspective. I remember that there was such a committee or a roundtable in the Canadian federal government at one time, but there isn't now, and there is no such roundtable in the Ontario government. The Ontario government has a lot of roundtables, but it doesn't have one on looking ahead. And I think that is something that Cacor could very well promote. And I would love to hear opinions from many of you on that subject, and I hope these opinions will be recorded. My third recommendation is one that is quite simple, but it's also very general, and it's headed Important Projects in Poor Countries or something like that. And I want to just give you one example. Helmut Burkhardt, who was mentioned already by Steve when he was introducing me. Helmut Burkhardt was present at a roundtable that I organized in 2006 with a member of, and the other organizer was a member of the forestry faculty at the University of Toronto. And Helmut brought up the fact that the country Niger, which is a small and very poor country in sort of mid-north Africa, had only enough trees in the entire country to last 10 years because people cooked by cutting down live trees and burning the wood. And at that, a year later, I had the opportunity to talk to Stephen Lewis about this. And unfortunately, he was 100% involved in his dealing with AIDS in Africa, and he never was able to get round to that one. But I found out very recently that in African countries today, there are solar cookers which are being distributed, or rather they're being sold, mainly by large non-governmental organizations. And it isn't a program which is going awfully well, and I don't know the reasons, but I suspect they are two. One is that they have to buy them, and these people are poor and cannot afford the better ones. And the other is that they like their traditional method of cooking, which you can do in daylight or at night, whereas the solar cookers can only be used in the day. I think that the borders of all of the forests in Africa are suffering for this simple reason that the trees are used for cooking. And I think it's the kind of thing, I'm not saying I think there are many, many other things parallel to that could be done, but it's the kind of thing that governments could subsidize to make some real progress in protecting forest. I'm assuming that everybody listening to me is aware of the vital importance of looking after forest and in fact improving it. Now, so that finishes the first three items I wanted to bring up, and I'm changing now into a new topic entirely, and that of taxation. And here I have several things to propose. I think well, I don't think I know that what I'm about to say was due to the late Herman Daly, an economist who was essentially an ecological economist. And he made the following proposition, which was published, I think, by his students rather than by himself. He said that it was essential to abolish taxes such as taxes on value added, sales taxes, and taxes on what did I say, sales taxes and taxes on services. It was very important to abolish all those taxes completely and put your taxes on primary resources. Now, that's something that you can verify. You can look at numerically. And so what I did is I sat down and used some figures that I had obtained at a store where you buy paper. And the idea was to see what Herman Daly's formula would do if you wanted to bring recycled paper down to the price of new paper made entirely with new fibers. Next slide, I think, Steve. You're on the tax. That's the one there. I hope you can read it. The first line is the prices of paper made with new fibers, paper that is 100% cycled and paper that is 70% recycled. And you can see the prices of the 70% recycled is quite a bit higher than the new paper. And then you put the tax on. Now, suppose you now put a tax on trees. So you have so much a ton taxation for cutting trees, which for this purpose, I'm regarding as a primary resource. It isn't something you dig out of the earth, but if you cut down all your trees, you have to wait at least 80 years before you have any other big ones. So what you do is you raise the tax on trees, and trees are not usually taxed at all. They're assumed to have no value, so you can go and cut them and keep all the profit for yourself. You tax the trees, and this raises the price of the paper, the new paper, and then it brings it up to the level of the recycled paper, the 70% recycled paper. The reason I chose 70% is because if there's going to be mainly recycled paper in the future, you have to add at least 30% of new fiber to keep the quality up to standard, up to what you want, what you need for your printer or whatever you're using it for, or for making newspapers. And so you see that it's possible to raise the two to the same price, and then you get the result is that the government makes slightly more tax that way, but people have to pay more for their paper, but not hugely more, and for recycled paper, and they pay less for recycled paper than they're paying now because you've taken the tax off. So that gives you an example of what the effect is if you follow Herman Daly's precepts, and it gives you an idea. I would like to hear some commentary on that, and I'm now going to move to the next point, which is in the next slide. Can I have the next slide? No, one back. One back.
Taxation.
Yeah, no, back again.
No, well, that's the Herman Daly one.
Yeah, all right, one back again. It's one with a diagram. Try back again.
There
Yeah,
you go.
yes.
Lumber.
This is since we were talking about forest a moment ago, and I was talking about trees even more recently. This is a diagram that Robert Hoffman's people made for a conference in 2006, a roundtable which I've already referred to, and it shows the rise of supply and demand over a large number of years. Now, where we are now on this curve is in a region where we are cutting somewhat more trees than we should be cutting for a sustainable supply. And if one, and this was also already the case in 2007, the excess of what we were cutting annually over what the forests can produce wasn't huge, but what happens is that the lumber companies go in and they cut a bit more than they really should be cutting just to sort of fulfill the demand. The curve that Robert Hoffman's people came up with using a very good model, and this is global, this is not for Canada or for any particular country, it's the total of all the tree cutting in the world. And what this shows that if you continue this until the year 2038, suddenly you have a huge inability to fulfill the demand. And I asked Robert Hoffman, I said, why is that? He said, well, you've cut down all the big trees. So all you have left in 2038 is small diameter trees. And the production from then on drops by a factor of 3/4 down to a very low level that you can see in this diagram. You can prevent the disaster if it is a disaster, in 2038 by starting to restrict the cutting a little bit earlier. You restrict it, let's say, next year, and then what happens is that the upward slope declines, flattens out, and comes down, and it never reaches as low as it does in the diagram I'm showing. And they also produced a diagram like that, and I'm sorry I don't have it. I wasn't able to show it. And so that's what I wanted to say about forests and overcutting. And all of these things are interrelated, because if you reduce the size of the forests, of course, what is a small overcutting now becomes a large one later. Let's go now on to a new subject, and that is corporate taxation. My recommendations for corporate taxation are basically two. The first is that corporate taxation should not just be based on the corporation as if all corporations were the same, like supposing all corporations were single individuals. The variety between a small individual consumes a lot and one who doesn't is not absolutely huge, but the variety between a very small corporation and a very, very large one is absolutely immense. I believe that the taxation of corporations should be based on the number of full-time employees which I can define for you, but I'm not going to spend time on that. That's the detail. On the number of full-time employees. So you would tax not the profits of the corporation, but you would tax the profits per full-time employee. It turns out, if you do this, and it turns out to be a fair thing to do, it turns out if you do this, it produces a disinclination for industries to use robots indiscriminately. And the idea my idea of robots is that they're very important and very useful because they can do jobs that you couldn't ask anybody to do, at least not honestly. But there is a fear always in among the workforce that they are going to be turned out of jobs because of robots. And I think this change has that additional effect that it would make the arbitrary choice of using robots less attractive. The second thing I believe that ought to be tried in the taxation of corporations is to have thresholds or a continuum that are analogous to the taxation that we have all experienced of individuals. That is to say, the first few dollars are not taxed at all, and then the tax gets higher the wealthier you are. In the case of corporations, it would be that the tax gets higher the bigger your profit is. I remember in the post-war years in Great Britain, when they were trying to pay off the war debt, the taxation was called income tax, the lowest level, and then they had a level called profits tax, and then they had a level called excess profits tax. So they had two thresholds above the base, but there was no threshold at which you paid no tax at all. I'm very much looking forward to opinions on that. Now, this is a very much change of subject, and here I have a fairly up-to-date story to tell you. And of course, I'm at a disadvantage sitting here that I don't know how many of my listeners believe that the global population should go on increasing, and how many believe it should decrease, and how many believe it should flatten out. And Steve, if you have a way of finding out by asking the audience, I'd love to know what fraction of the people who are listening to me now think that the global population should go on increasing. In my book, I made a case which I thought was a strong case for a decreasing population, but a slowly decreasing population, not a fast decreasing population. And the reason for choosing a slowly decreasing population is because if you have too fast a decreasing population, you have to cut the birth rate to a level where there aren't enough young people to fill the jobs when they get to whatever age they start employment, 18, 20, 22, whenever they start work. I think it's important not to aim for a full, rapid global reduction in population. So what I want to tell you about now, which is a little bit off the subject since this doesn't have immediately to do with my recommendation as such, the recommendation is, by the way, that all countries that have footprints larger than their biocapacities should move into a mode of a slow decrease of population, and that this should be done by every government in a way that it isn't offensive to the population. In fact, at the moment, there's only one country with an intentional decreasing population, and the population is entirely in agreement with the government policy, and that is Japan. That is the way to do it, with the people behind you. Japan's decrease in population started, it's very hard to tell how many years ago, because the peak of anything is always very flat before it starts to turn down slightly. But today, if you tried to identify a steady rate of increase from the Japanese data, it would come to something like 0.53% per annum, 0.5% per annum. And I worked out that if this continued for 32 years, it would reduce a population of 150 million to one of 125 million. And there would still be plenty of births, and the distribution of young, middle-aged, and old people would be very much as it is now in countries, in developed countries, which do not have large birth rates. There's another thing I want to tell you about the population, which really stunned me. China has begun its decline, which is good news. And the reason is, I think, because although Chinese are now allowed by law to have more children than they used to be allowed, the birth rate hasn't increased significantly yet, but the rate of increase of the expectation of life has decreased. And it was a very high rate of increase before. It's now lower, and this has turned what was an increasing population at 0.4% per annum into a decreasing population, and the rate of decrease is very slight. There are 4 countries, other countries, there are 19 other countries that have declining rates of declining populations, and half of them are small countries with poor economies, and the decreases are due to migration into other countries, and they have nothing to do with the global population. But then there are 4 important countries with additional countries who have very slowly, very slight decreases in population, mostly less than 0.3% per annum. So very, very small declines, and the declines are decreasing. And these countries are Italy, Russia, Spain, and South Korea. And what fascinated me and shocked me was that in all 4 countries, the leadership is pushing for an increase in the birth rate. And I think somehow that is not a sound policy, but I leave it to you to make comments on that. How much time do I have? Another 10 minutes, Steve?
Oh, I think it could be 15 or 20.
Right, okay, very good. I move now on to bringing about conversations. This is something that I haven't seen anywhere, but I think the world as a whole has missed a huge opportunity these last 30 years, since it became 30 years ago or 28 years ago, it was pretty well certain that climate change was on the rampage it's on. And the kind of conversations I'm talking about are conversations where, which were in a way formal. You would have meetings for these conversations to take place, but you would have government present, you would have industries present, and you would have members of the public present, hopefully some of them full of knowledge and wisdom, as one sometimes is very happy to come across. I think we could have avoided all kinds of horrors if we had had these conversations in motion. And my question is it too late to start conversations of this kind to avoid multiplying the misfortunes that the human race has been piling upon itself these past 28 or 30 years? I'd love to hear some of your responses to that. My next recommendation is 6B in my book, spreading Robert Hoffman's ideas. For example, CANESS in capitals, CANESS. When I was writing the first edition of my book, Robert Hoffman sent me a statement that he had invented this tool, this modeling tool, CANESS, and he was using it as a method to achieve reductions of emissions, global emissions of CO2 as quickly as possible. And he did at least a year's research on CANESS with this purpose. And one of his conclusions that he came to was that it was already too late, and this would be around 2018. It was already too late to get the emissions of CO2 across the world to zero by using carbon taxes or cap and trade. Personally, I never had any faith in cap and trade because it has to be applied very rigorously if you want it to work, and predictably it wasn't. I think carbon taxes can still have a use, but Hoffman's point, which is undoubtedly correct, is that you can only get the emissions down to zero by policy. Now, this puts responsibility on governments like the Canadian government and the US government that haven't had the least intention to do anything up until now. At least that's the impression I have about getting to zero emissions. It's the population, it's the technology people, it's the concerned citizens who are interested in facing up to climate change and doing something about it. I was very happy to see, one last thing about Robert Hoffman. One of the things he proposed was that any country, like Canada, for example, if they adopted his proposal, they would allow new cars that use gasoline to be sold for only 10 more years. Then, for about 10 years after that, they would allow gasoline cars to be driven, but they wouldn't allow any more to be sold. And then during the final years, the remaining gasoline burning cars would be removed from the roads. So, and he explained very nicely how the 10-year intervals were enough to get the alternatives going. Okay, I was absolutely delighted when the British Prime Minister, the one who is joked about nowadays, was the first person in the world to adopt this as a national policy. He may not have known about Robert Hoffman's work, but he adopted precisely the policy to allow gasoline-driven cars to be on sale for only 10 years. Then Canada followed suit and Quebec followed suit, but with longer, unnecessarily long time intervals, giving the automobile corporations more time than Robert Hoffman said they needed to do the conversion from sales of gasoline-propelled cars to no sales of such cars. Hoffman did a lot of other things, but I'm going to skip now to the three subjects which are perhaps my favorites, and they all tie in with some things I've already said, and that is increasing natural wealth, a new recommendation, R7, in the version of my book which is just about to come out. Organic farming, for example, looking after forests, and then finally going a bit beyond my recommendations, developing super productive forests. First, let me talk about increasing natural wealth. It's absolutely vitally important that governments, plural, whether they're provincial governments in Canada or federal governments, that governments set up organizations that are going to pursue these goals, namely increasing natural wealth. The way you increase...
Next slide, please.
Oh, yes. I'm on R7 now.
I was asking Art to go to the next slide.
Yeah, I'll go back to the other one in a minute. It's the way you increase natural wealth on farmlands is you make sure that the soil gets better and better every year, and then we have this certificate that people can win that allows them to put organic on their products. By the time you get an organic farm, you have more than 2 feet depth of very, very good, very much alive soil. And the products you get are more nutritious, more resistant to insects, etc. And the way you do it for forest is twofold. First of all, you restore the minerals that have been decreased by repeated forestry, removing trees without putting anything back in their place. And 45 years ago, it was already known that you reduce the nitrogen in the soil if you cut trees, let's say every 50 years, then it doesn't take terribly long, only a few intervals of 50 years to reduce the quality of the soil. And I've been convinced by somebody who knows a lot about forestry that trees, in fact, today are not as good as they were, let's say, at the beginning of the 19th century. There's a third thing you can also clean up rivers and lakes, and you can do cleaning up in the ocean, at least on your own territorial waters. So I'll go now very briefly back to organic farming. My recommendation there is there simply because I couldn't find anything in the literature that says how fast should we be increasing soil that is of the quality we call organic, that's suitable for organic farming. And everybody wants to do it, and organic farms are increasing. The total area of organic farms is increasing in many countries, including Quebec province, the United States. I don't know about the English-speaking provinces in Canada, and many, many countries, other countries. But what should be the target? So I suggested in the last edition of my book that it should be that we should aim for 70% of farms to be organic by the year 2040. I haven't had any negative comments on that suggestion, but I also haven't had any positive. So I'd like to know whether people who are informed about farming think that that is fast enough to make a difference. Lastly, but not least, I want to talk about forests, and especially the development of super productive forests. It will be costly to restore the forest floor of forest areas that have been somewhat overforested these past 200 years, but it won't be a vast cost, but it needs to be undertaken. But then I thought, what about, and we need an organization to do it. Then I thought about how about developing super productive forest? Now, for those of you who don't know, who've never seen a super productive forest, these are forests with very deep soil of the same excellent quality that you have in organic farms, and the trees grow better. If they are nut trees, the nuts are far more numerous, far more give more nutrition. The super productive forest attracts animals and birds so that you have altogether more life in a super productive forest. I've only ever seen one super productive forest, a small tiny part of it, for one afternoon. And it was amazing. It's at a place called Saint-Lazare, a few miles west of Montreal, and it has 18 hectares of area, and it's a rectangular area in the middle of habitation, not dense city habitation, but what one might call outer suburb habitation. 35 years ago, the forest was level with the road. There are roads to the east and west and north and south, which surround this piece of forest, and the forest belongs to a single individual, and he decided to encourage the people in the neighborhood to bring all their live matter that could be composted and just throw it anywhere they liked on his forest. And they did. They came on foot or by car, and they brought bundles of grass and long grass and anything else you can think of, kitchen waste and so on. And one such person dumped a bundle like that in the forest while I was there. The forest, amazingly, is now 10 feet higher than the road it used to be parallel with. So you have to go up a steep path to get into this forest. And I said to the owner, I said, surely once you've got 4 feet of good soil, it doesn't pay to go any deeper, does it? He says, oh no, it does. He said it because it gives the trees a vertical taproot that makes them very secure, and it improves the overall nutrition. So that was a surprise. So once I had left this amazing forest, which has there are mushrooms growing everywhere, and as I said, more animals and life of every kind growing in this forest. I said to myself, this is something that we should try to do to make the Canadian forest like that. So I did back of the envelope calculation, and in a minute or so, I was able to show that it would take many, very, very many centuries, many thousands of years to convert the entire Canadian forest, at least the accessible parts of Canadian forest, into that kind of forest. It would not be something that we could do in a stretch of 35 years, which is how long it took this individual to build up 10 feet of topsoil, and in places it's 12 feet deep. So I said, well, what could we do then that would be practical? And this is a new idea I'm trying to circulate, that I think if you look at any map of a Canadian province, you could draw circles around the center of any big city until you came to a region that is not heavily inhabited and is perhaps already forested, but at least this region that's surrounding the city could be turned into super productive forest. And if you think of a big city, it's going to unfortunately be rather far from the center. But in Toronto, for example, there's an area around the city which has been designated for green pastures, and the present Premier of Ontario is trying to violate this, and he wants to put buildings in this area that has been preserved so far as a green area. But what about having a super productive forest there? Wouldn't it be absolutely wonderful to have excellent trees and excellent forest products and lots of wild animals in a huge semicircle around Toronto, if that were possible? In fact, the east and west ends of Toronto are probably so built up that it may be too late. But I can think of smaller towns, very many, where this would be relatively easy to do. And but the point being that you don't want this to be a very costly thing in terms of organizations. You want it to be something where people can go and dump their kitchen waste, and they're going to do it, as has been evidenced in this area that I went. People are willing to contribute that much. Well, I think that comes to the end of what I really wanted to say today. I have 5 other items on my list, but I think they're all can wait, and if there is time later on, I could perhaps deal with 1 or 2 of them. But the ones I really wanted to talk about, I've done with, and I'd like to hear what responses we can get from the audience and from members of Cacor in particular. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Derek. There are some entries in chat, and why don't we just start from the beginning? Richard Vanderjagt has a point to make. Richard?
Thank you. Thank you for, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, fine. Yes, the issue of making, or having organic farming is right up. Last year, as you know, I gave a talk on environmental toxins and their effect on health. And we have been trying to make a point to actually a Senate committee that was looking at the effect of environmental toxins on health. But at the same time, we're looking at the effect of what is spread in, the things that are spread on crops and their effect on the environment as well. And that seemed to go right over their heads, and Bill S6 unfortunately went on to Parliament. But I still think we could go back, perhaps as Cacor, and go back to some of the people who were on that parliamentary committee and present your ideas, Derek, along with the ideas that we presented to them about how we ought to be regulating toxins, and present it as a package to them and say that there needs to be a lot more work done. I really applaud what you've done and what you're working on, and I think it's excellent.
Thank you.
Any comment?
No, I'm very thrilled to hear about this Senate committee. It happens I didn't know about it.
Well, the problem is a lot of the, and actually they were at in Montreal as well. Is Crop Life was all over the place. They have so much influence, selling their poisons to the farmers, which then ends up in the food chain, and we all eat it, and it has effects on everybody's health. We spend billions on it. We're talking the government, it's in the Globe today about how many billions the government is going to give towards healthcare, when in fact we ought to be preventing disease and not spending time on treating it.
Yep. Yeah, the point about the nutrition is very good. I'm confronted by that very much here where I'm living, that it's harder to get the organic stuff here where I'm living than it was where I used to be living. And it makes a difference. You have to eat more to get the same nutrition.
That's true. Oh, I couldn't agree more. I think we ought to chat to perhaps, maybe I can get your contact afterwards. I think there's some room here for some mutual collaboration.
Wonderful. Okay, Mike Nickerson's up next. Mike, are you still here?
I'm here. I'm on it. I've got a comment and a question. The comment has to do with the idea of taxing corporations proportional to their full-time employees. And I think that's brilliant. I never thought of it, but it would have an effect, although one of the effects might be that they would then only hire people part-time. And I think what you should do is take their entire payroll and divide it by a full-time employment pay, and then come up with a figure, because they've been known to do things like hire people just shy of what makes it necessary to give them the support that, dental care and medical. Anyway, so that's my comment. My question has to do with advertising. As you know, I'm very much concerned about the culture of consumption, because it's a big part of our problem, the more fun, less stuff approach. Advertising is a massive education campaign to teach people to be consumers. And right now, corporations get tax deductions for the money they spend on advertising. And that might make sense for saying, we have this product, this is what it does, this is what it's worth. But when they start using their time to psychologically manipulate populations, maybe that should be banned, but in lieu of not banning it, they should at least not get a tax credit for it. What do you think of having a tax on advertising, or a removal of tax exemption on advertising?
I have two comments. One is on your comment, and that is that in my book, I fully take into account the fact that companies would try to cheat on the question of how many employees. And so I worded it as full-time employees, but what I meant really, and I've been a bit more specific recently, is people who are on the pension, are part of the company pension plan. But the whole thing needs looking at, and there are some companies that wouldn't have pension plans and so on. But I totally agree with your comment. And I have been thinking along the same lines as you have. With regard to advertising, I think the situation with advertising today is so absolutely appalling that it needs a really major revision. The purposes of advertising actually have to change. And I think it needs an enormous debate. And the point that you raised is absolutely one of them. It's one of the, but I can think of a lot of other points that need to be raised. There needs to be a very big debate about advertising. The reason advertising isn't in my list of recommendations is because the debate that you and I are talking about hasn't even begun. You and I remember a few months ago, were the only people I could find in the world who are thinking along these lines about advertising. I'm sure there are others, but neither you nor I had met them. So I think what you say is good about advertising, but I think the problem is a very, very big problem, and that I think advertising has to perhaps become a set of corporations that are benefit corporations. So we enter the whole business of benefit corporations, and are they going anywhere? And at the moment they are not. And the reason they are not is because there's more push behind B corporations, which are quite different. And the distinction I don't have time to explain to you, but it's all in my book, the difference between a benefit corporation and a B corporation. But I think if all advertising corporations were benefit corporations, that would be a start to the thing. But I think advertising has allowed our civilization to decline in important ways, and that something has to be done about that.
And it's further to that, because advertising is just an interface with this notion of reviving a culture where people get their satisfaction from living, from their families and communities and personal exploits and so on. Do you get into that at all in your book?
I don't, but I have very much in mind that it needs to be brought up. Just recently, I was reminded that when I first came to Canada, I went to live in Kingston, Ontario, and I lived there quite a long time. And I was deeply shocked at the lack of facilities for people in the age range, let's say 12 to 18, the sports facilities, and so that you got kids sort of, you know, standing around in groups with nothing to do in the late evenings, and this kind of thing that can or may not lead to mischief, and usually they didn't. But I thought that the provision of an interesting life for people in that age group was next to nothing. And so it seems to me that we need to look at this whole business. I think watching TV has become a substitute for much healthier things that people in that same age group I just mentioned do and would like to do. I'm amazed that there isn't more delinquency having regard to how we run society, but I appreciate your remarks very much.
More fun, less stuff.
Exactly.
Ted Manning is up next.
Hi there. I'm going to take you on behalf of Rob Hoffman, because we have been colluding for some time to get rid of the notion that we can tax anybody into submission. We have discovered that the reaction to raise taxes is much less than the economists or sociologists have told us. And we pretty well have to tax them completely into submission to get any reaction at all. And as I noted in my note, bribes and coercion are about the only thing that will work. And certainly in a lot of the third world, the only control over behaviors is corruption. You make it too expensive, people will then stop doing it. Anyway, that said, we're talking money all the time. And just like Mike says, more fun, less stuff. And yet we keep expressing value in terms of money. And in fact, just to add one point, we are working in the Club of Rome to try and develop a brand new metric on what we call well-being, which has many dozens of variables in it, very few of which are economic, and which are actually trying to capture those metrics that might allow people to understand whether they are doing better or doing worse, not just dying with more. So I appreciate much what you have raised. And the idea is, I would reiterate Rob's idea that don't try and use taxes as the lever. Try and pry government, try and pry corporations, try and change the rules so they can't do what's really stupid.
I have a question. I'm not quite sure where your point of view conflicts with mine, which you seem to imply.
No, not at all. I'm reinforcing yours. We're two
Oh,
aspects of the
okay,
same thing.
sorry, I thought you had intended to, but
No.
it seemed to me that absolutely makes sense. And what I didn't say, and I'm going to say it now, about the sales taxes, I mean the tax on services. I think that the tax on, for example, on restaurants is absolutely objectionable, and it makes it very difficult to run a restaurant and even make a tiny profit at doing it. The numbers of restaurants that go broke annually in the societies I've lived in is quite large. And so I think taxing something before you've made a profit and then you tax the profit if there is a profit made, I don't think it's fair game. I think you have to let the guy who runs a restaurant sell his meals and then tax him if he's making a large profit. That's fair. To tax before he's made any profit is not fair. And I remember when that tax was first introduced, I think it was Mulroney that introduced it, the arguments against it were, you heard them every day, yet it went ahead and it passed law. because he had a majority in Parliament. Thank you.
I can interject one thing as moderator. I believe when you go to a restaurant, at least my experience is that the person who's doing the eating is paying that tax on top of the bill. And it goes directly to the government, and it's not coming out of the pocket of the proprietor. But it does keep a bit of a weight on the prices, because the proprietor might raise the prices 5% if the tax wasn't there, or 10%. I think they're as high as 10 or 12% in some places. But that's just some editorial comment.
Yes, Steve, I'd like to answer that.
Yeah.
I think there's a psychological factor here, and I'm a person who doesn't mind occasionally spending money, but when I feel that I'm not getting the value for money, I tend not to do that thing. And so I think that the 10% sales tax has more than a 10% effect on the number of people who go to that restaurant. So it is, I think it's a considerable effect.
Perhaps.
In other words, you go to restaurants, but you go a lot less often than you would.
Well, if I wanted to use that tool to stop you from eating in restaurants, I'd just put 100% tax on.
Yeah, I'd go very rarely.
Yeah, well, the notion really being the tax instruments are very crude, and they got to be very huge to really make that many people decide not to go out for the birthday, even though it's going to cost them a hell of a lot.
No, they'll go for the birthday, but
Yeah.
they'll not go on a couple of other occasions when they would have gone. I agree with that.
Yeah.
Okay, John Legg. Hi, John.
Yeah, Steve,
Yep.
hold on here, mute, that's okay. We'll
Sure.
start this stuff here. Okay. Derek, very good. Your whole idea is a very good one about getting input on your recommendations. So I congratulate you for that. You may want to consider even writing down in point form the particular recommendations, and if people feel they have the time, then they can write back to you, and then you'll have the reaction in a more considered way. Anyway, my two, I guess there are really only 2 points, and they're the very first ones. And I will say that I have bounced in and around the UN for years. So the first one, I understood that the Economic and Social Council you thought might be given more weight. My reaction to that is that in spite of the messiness of the Security Council and the fact that there is a formal veto given to the 5 original nuclear powers, and we all know who they are. In spite of that messiness, I think the Security Council is so much more important than the Economic and Social Council. And by the way, that's known among people who are really, really into full-time the UN. It's known as the ECOSOC, Economic and Social Council. And the reason that the Security Council has so much more weight is for the original reasons. It was the important, that is the nuclear powers, who had the veto, whereas the original, or the how should I say, the body, the global body, the League of Nations, which came before the UN, again, there I'm really not up on everything, but I think it was considered to be not very well based, and that's why it went out and the UN came in. So again, I think it would be seen as an artificial affair to give Economic and Social Council more weight. But again, that's nothing against your recommending it. Okay, my second one had to do with your idea of encouraging a longer time frame for certain things, and it wasn't clear to me what the things would be, but I don't think that if one sought, for example, to put the IPCC on a shorter time frame. Right now, I think it's a 4-year time frame. That's the International Panel for Climate Change. I think the nagging function of a much shorter period would be lost, and it would be so much easier to just go to sleep. Now, with the malevolent input of the fossil fuel industry, it's already, seems to me, hard to get anything done in the IPCC. And that's because I think the governments have such a power to reread and take out anything they don't like in the first of many drafts of the IPCC. It's already easy enough to do nothing in between. But if you increase the time frame, well, I think it would be an excuse to sit back and do nothing. And there are those, including myself, who would argue that almost nothing has been done anyway, and that's the problem. So anyway, those are my two main comments, and the population one later on. I just, it seems to me so difficult to have any effect on population. I'm just not sure what a recommendation would do, but again, why not bring it to your readers' attention? So I guess that's about it. The first, my main ones were the first two, that is the ECOSOC, Economic and Social Council, more weight to it, and then increasing the time frame. No, I think countries need all the nagging they can get. So there we are, for what it's worth.
I'd like to make two comments in reply to that. In the case of ECOSOC, I think my suspicion was that things are as you said, and I think the idea of that I wanted to get across was that ECOSOC in principle should be very important, and if it isn't, then anything we can do to make it more important will be very useful. I don't have enough knowledge of how it works to be able to expand on that. With regard to the 30-year time span, I think you've misunderstood me. I'm not suggesting that we should allow 30 years for things to take place that should be done in the next 4 years. Just the opposite. The purpose of roundtables with a long-term view rather than a short-term view is to be able to warn governments that what they are doing now will impede what will happen, what they want to see the things as being 30 years down the road. I've already mentioned this once, in maybe not with Cacor, but 22 years ago, I was supervising a 2-student project at the University of Toronto on envisaging a self-sustaining province of Ontario in the year 2050. And this was a most successful project. The students proved that it was possible for Ontario to become self-sustaining in a world where nobody had food to export to Ontario, etc. But they were also able to specify the conditions that would make that possible. And what we learned by looking, it was then 40 years ahead, not 30, but what we learned by looking 40 years ahead was that everything being done in Ontario in those years, 2010, 11, 12, was wrong. In other words, everything that was being decided was making it more difficult for Ontario to survive in a difficult future rather than easier. So looking ahead 20 years at the goal you want is essential to making good decisions. That's what I meant. And obviously I didn't convey that in the written recommendation. So I will have to change that recommendation, and thank you very much.
Thank you for that. I had in fact interpreted that. So thank you for your clarification, Derek. Thank you.
Okay. Leilith has recommended a book, and she's posted links on it, but I don't know if there's anything that she wants to say about it.
I can't do it right now, but I'll look afterwards. And make a note for me. Thanks, Steve.
Yes, it's in the chat. It's called Empty Planet is the name of the book.
Oh, good.
Got a book review. My position is that, and it goes along with what Bill Reese's position is that we're probably 800% overpopulated, and there's nothing good that comes from taking our time to do the reduction. Nature's doing it quite increasing rates right now. So, but I'm going to continue on here. Now, Richard has had Richard Van der Yonk has had 2 or 3 other interjections, and if there's anything he wants to say more at this point, that's fine. And if not, we'll go to David Harries. So, Richard, last chance here. I guess he's not here. Okay. David Harries, are you there? Well, it looks like he's gone. And we're down to 19. Okay, you'll have to read that. He's talking about water in his comment in India. Nigel Weir, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Excellent.
Derek, thank you for an excellent set of suggestions. The first one that jumped out at me was the need to develop the medium-term view, say 30 years. I just wanted to remind everybody that, in fact, several decades ago, we had an economic council. We also had a social, a science council. And they wrote several reports. I think they were quite decent from what I remember of them. Those councils were done in, I think, in the 80s by the Mulroney government. But I think that there's a role for that sort of view. It would be productive, but not a total answer by any means. And perhaps we would want to have it as an ecological economic council or something. I'm not suggesting that those particular councils should be reformed as they were. So my second comment, advertising. I share concerns about advertising, and But that's a very meaty topic as to how to define persuasion versus information, and how to and the support needed to bring out tighter rules on advertising. But I think they should be given thought. My pet peeve right now is watching the commercials with SUVs and Dodge Ram Chargers charging through the forest. And yet this is as if that's the best way to enjoy nature. But at the same time, the automobile industry is shifting to electric cars and perhaps a different point of view, but that does not seem to be reflected in their advertising. It's as if they want to sell as many of these monsters while they can. Anyway, thank you.
Okay, Claude Butner. Claude, are you there? I think he might have gone. Well, he was commenting about forests and water vapor, and you'll see that, Derek, in the chat when you read it later. Raymond Lurie. How you doing?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Good, good.
A few comments from my perspective. So thanks, Derek. I think there's some interesting and some compelling ideas in what you're suggesting, but I just want to maybe interject a dose of reality into some of these suggestions. So, for example, the idea of taxing based on a number of employees or profit per employees. There's so many ways for people to game that, and there's so you may remember, for those of you who were following the tech sector and the stock market over the last 2 decades, that one of the very popular metrics for assessing the performance of a company became the revenue per employee metric, which to me makes no sense at all. And how did a company, like I used to work for Microsoft at the time, and how did they increase the revenue per employee? Well, they increased it by reducing the employees. And what they did is they took some jobs that were internally resourced through employees of the company as such, and outsourced them. And so in doing that, what they were doing is that about half of the workforce that was actually doing work for the company was contractors of all types, right? So that effectively doubled the amount of revenue per employee without really changing anything about the status of how many employees and all that were there. And actually, I would argue made the situation worse for those who were contractors, because they were treated as second class because they were not employees. They were just contractors that were sort of disposable, right? So, and depending on the industry you work in, so if you look at service industries like fast food, for example, the revenue per employee is relatively low and profit per employee is relatively low. So it's, but that's a feature of the industry. It's just, there's just so much you could charge for a hamburger, right? So the other comment too is advertising, and I've heard this thing about we should reduce fossil fuel or ban fossil fuel advertising, but at this point in time, I'm concerned about the side effects of doing that. So we've already banned tobacco and alcohol advertising, as well as or hard liquor advertising in Canada, and we've banned the advertising of prescription drugs. But what that does is it reduces the amount of money that's available to finance the media organizations that are supposed to be independent. We could argue whether they're independent or not and all that, but so if there's less funding for media, less funding for newsrooms and all that, because they have less advertising, which is exactly what the newspapers have been telling us over the last decade or so, especially with the rise of the internet, social media and all that. Where do they get their revenue streams, right? Where do these people get money to actually fund these organizations? So it's nice to talk about some of these solutions, but unfortunately, a lot of them have some side effects. And also, if you look at carbon taxes as an example, I believe carbon taxes would be a wonderful way of evening out things and pushing people towards less carbon intensive technologies and solutions and all that. But for that to work, it has to be a relatively uniform across a globe solution, because then if the US decides that they're not going to have a carbon tax, then they're going to have an advantage compared to, say, Europe, which is trying to put a carbon tax in place right now, right? So all of these solutions are theoretically, they make a lot of sense and all that, and we know what needs to be done to resolve this climate change issue. The problem, though, is we need to find ways to get people to actually implement these changes, right? And to me, there's really two ways to do that. Way number one is revolution. Okay, so we break the system apart and we start a new system of some sort. I'm not particularly in favor of that, because that tends to create lots of bloodshed and tends to result in uncertain outcomes. So there's no certainty that after a revolution of some kind that we would have a better system than what we have now. The other option is to use the existing system to try to change things. So this is where I see the role of things like carbon taxes and also government intervention to make better solutions for the planet more economically viable. Right, so things like the Inflation Reduction Act in the U.S., where they're putting lots of money into EVs and green technologies and all. I think those are the solutions that are going to lead us to a reasonable possibility of getting better outcomes in the short to medium term.
I'd like to respond to that. First of all, what you said about the first point was on the employment. What you said on the employment question was absolutely in agreement with what I said. It wasn't. I was facing the reality that companies were doing the kind of thing that you said, and in order to save money or save taxes. I think that was the whole point of that recommendation, that the taxation be based on the income of the company, or sorry, the profit of the company divided by the number of employees. And how that is going to be defined is a little bit difficult, but I thought you were in accord. Now, when it came to the questions about advertising, the reasons I couldn't go into that is simply because the advertising problem is so huge and has so many facets that it would need at least a conference, not just an hour's talk and questions and answers or something like that. It would need a whole conference to even come to the first base. It's a very, very difficult problem because the advertising companies are very, very able. They know exactly what they're doing, and they're doing it to their advantage and the advantage, the immediate fiscal advantage of their clients. But the problem is what Mike Nickerson has already brought up twice at Wednesday conferences of Cacor. He's already brought up those points twice. The problem is an immense one. It needs at least to start the debate, and you helped to start the debate today, and thank you very much for doing so. And so did Mike.
Okay. Claude Butner has put the Amazon details for Derek's book in the chat, and he's made a couple of other comments in the chat, and he's not here anymore. John Hollins is up next, and I see Hector Garcia's hand up, so I will get to you, Hector. Well, maybe John Hollins is not here.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, you there? You are.
Sorry, I simply wasn't ready.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
I just wanted to say that I had a very pleasant surprise fairly recently when I borrowed a book from the library by Marc Jacquard, who's an energy economist teaching at UBC. His book has a positive title, The Citizen's Guide to Climate Success. And I was actually quite surprised to find an economist, any economist, talking just the same way that Robert Hoffman does. So for anybody who would like to pursue that, I can recommend, which I totally didn't expect before I read it, this book called Climate Success. And I like the positive emphasis. And he concurs with Robert Hoffman's point that carbon tax is not going to work the way it should do. If you just think about gasoline or diesel, the price elasticity of customers for gasoline is extraordinarily low. And you never see that mentioned in governmental writing about climate change and carbon taxes. So the policy route is the way to go. And Marc Jacquard is completely in agreement with Robert Hoffman on that point. Thanks very much.
Great news. Thanks.
Okay, it looks like our last commenter is Hector Garcia.
Thank you. Derek, I don't know if you saw the message that I just sent to everybody regarding John Leck's comments, and also the mention of Joel Barker's new system to elicit willingness to see from people who are unwilling to see. I think it's essential to be able to foresee what might result if we don't change what we do. As you practice with your students for Ontario, and youth is usually more willing to envision the future and acknowledge mistakes. People in power are very unwilling to see because they don't want to be held accountable. So even if they realize that that they have a blind spot, a huge blind spot, they will not do it because it goes against their interest in making profits, which in this case would be the fossil fuels or the manufacturers of weapons. So I'm suggesting that John Leck's proposal is excellent. His comments are very good, and your recommendation for continuing
Maximum.
Continuing to elicit visions of the future is necessary, and I'm wondering if the Canadian Association would be willing to consider someone like Joel Barker, who has developed a system and put it into practice with quite a few organizations across the world. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Okay, well, Raymond Lurie has a couple of other notes, so if you want to have a
No comments? I'm sorry, no comments?
well, Derek didn't have a comment, it seems. You did mention Joel Barker's book, Paradigms, which if he's not familiar with, and I'm not, then we can just thank you for recommending it. So Raymond Lurie, looks like he's gone.
No, I'm still there.
Oh, you're still
So,
there?
yeah,
Okay,
I was just waiting for you to talk. Sorry about that.
Oh, you
So,
know, it's like playing a game show on TV where they keep juggling these picture squares around.
So I wanted to make some comments on the carbon tax and whether they're effective or not. So if you look at Economics 101, if you increase the price of something, demand will fall. Okay, and that's the basics of price elasticity, if you will. Now, when it comes to gas or diesel, if you have a high-priced object, i.e., a vehicle, that requires the use of some other commodity, i.e. gas or diesel, then it becomes very difficult for you to substitute the product in question. So the problem with gas and price elasticity is that you can't just change your car every day, essentially, right? So if you have a gas car, it may take years before it's ready for you to change the car. So that's why it takes a long time for increasing gas prices to have an impact on the market. Now, some of you may have noticed that pickup trucks weren't selling very well last year. Why? Because gas prices were high, right? So, but that's again an indication that it has a long-term impact or medium or long-term impact, not a short-term impact. Okay, so there is price elasticity in the fossil fuel industries for sure. The problem is we don't see it short-term because we're stuck with that. So if we have a gas furnace, and gas prices double like they did over the last year or so, well, what's our choice? We need to spend lots of money to replace that furnace. So people don't do it in the short term, hoping that the prices will come down again, right? But there's been actually a Nobel Prize that was won for an economist that was showing that the carbon taxes work, right? So the oil industry would like us to believe that carbon taxes don't work because they don't want them, but it's clear that they work. So I strongly object to any statement that they don't work, because it's been proven time and time again that they do.
I happen to agree with you.
I'd like to make just one point. There's a difference between the carbon taxes working in some ways and the carbon taxes being the route to zero emissions. I think that's the point that Robert Hoffman made. Sure, the carbon tax can be used in all sorts of ways, and is being used from time to time in some of those ways, but it isn't the road to zero. The road to zero is policy. That I think was the message. But thank you for your comments.
Yeah. So my reading is that is a bit more subdued, if I will. I'm thinking that we need a combination of both. There are some industries and utilizations where increasing the price will reduce consumption and eventually eliminate consumption, because if carbon taxes were high enough, gasoline and diesel will become simply unaffordable, right? Now, there are some other applications, and we could talk about that at length, where policy is a better instrument, and I absolutely agree with you that there are many cases like that. But certainly carbon taxes do have a role, and I think that they're good. They're blunt, very blunt, but they're an instrument that actually allows for rapid progress towards reducing emissions.
Okay, Stephen, Ted Manning has agreed to thank Derek.
Yeah, well, I got lots I could say. Apparently, we need to be more revolutionary, apparently. But I think that the real value of this discussion is that Derek broadened the thing to a whole range of different scientific, sociological, political, and other questions, showing just how integrated all of these issues really are. And we've had a number of very valid discussions on things like the carbon tax, for example. Given it one day, I'll bring a model for you where they've gone 100% off fuels on the island of El Hierro in the Canaries, by a combination of taxation, of regulation, and of subsidy, to the point now where there's not a drop of oil on the place unless you want to oil your sewing machine. but they're not allowed to have petroleum products at all on the island. Yes, it is possible. And is it replicable? Probably not. But at the same time, we need to consider the whole range of instruments that we have. And Derek, I think you have helped us a great deal in broadening the conversation, in looking at a range of questions and answers that we need to consider. And I hope you're going to give us the other 5, I think you said you haven't put in front of us yet. Let us know really what kind of future we can perhaps plan for and how we can make people make it happen. So thank you very much.
You're welcome.
And I guess my job too is to say to you, this is Jean not here right now. She usually thanks our speakers, but as her deputy, I will be quite happy to do that. That we are very much happy with the way that this series has run and the way it keeps gathering new ideas and new people. And we are just going to ask those of you who are not already subscribed, please do. We are also going to make a request to those who may not be members of Cacor. Please join us. It's pretty cheap. It's better value for money than most things, as he says, as he advertises things. So it's a good deal. And you're going to get the intelligence of an awful lot of people around here applied to real questions. And we're asking you as well to bring the questions. So we'd like to thank you again for coming. And Art, I think we're now at the point where we can just open it up and shut the recording off and have ourselves a further conversation for anyone who wishes to.